Hello everyone, how are you today?
Hi, Vicky. All good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Okay, I am going to share the PowerPoint that I have. There we go. All right. So I can't see you, but I can see the chat. So if you want to type in the chat, I'll try and keep an eye on it. If you would like to just, ask a question out loud or tell me a little story, just interrupt me and you can do that. All right, so for our second tutorial, I want to just have a quick look at the learning outcomes. So these are the learning outcomes that are for the whole module. And we looked a little bit at physical development and, motor skills and all that in the workshop, and a tiny little bit on perceptual skills. Mostly that's just in the content that's on Blackboard. What I want to focus on in the tutorial is applying the information processing model, because it's one of the things that you can talk about in your assessment task. And also it's like the key thing about how the brain learns and how it's just really important. It's like a core idea for the thing. So we're going to talk about that. All right, we're going to start with a Menti. Oh, I've got the number in there. The number is a different number. Here's the link for the Menti. And I'll type the number in if you like to use it on your phone. All right. So just to sort of get our brains in the space, what sort of things do you do that help you stay focused when you're trying to learn? Music, yeah. Remove distractions, yep. Nice and quiet. I also like it really quiet. I don't like to have any music at all. I get too distracted by the music, start singing and dancing and yeah. Sitting in nature, that's nice. Phone away. Interest in the topic is a really important one. That's an intrinsic motivation. When you have interest in the topic, it's really hard to learn things that you're just not interested in. I'm sure we've all done subjects at school or at uni that you just were like, I just am so not interested in that. And you've got to find new ways to try to get yourself to do it. And that then sometimes you have to use extrinsic rewards. Like if I study this topic I don't like for 25 minutes, then I can have a chocolate, so you can give yourself little extrinsic rewards. Or your lecturer might give you little extrinsic pressures by giving you little quizzes. Got to study for the quiz. And that's extrinsic as well. All right, so we're going to have a look at the information processing model of memory. And this is a fairly, standard diagram of that. And you can see that we start over here with stimuli, so some kind of stimulus that might be sights or sounds or feelings or whatever that's stimulating part of your brain. And then that's going to enter into your sensory memory, which has a fairly small capacity and is pretty short. So some things, like you might see something out of the corner of your eye and not pay too much attention to it. That's gone in less than a second. It's all over. Uh, if it does catch your attention, then attention acts like a filter that will select information that moves into your working memory, which is like a temporary workspace for thinking about things. It has a fairly limited capacity as well. I actually think it's a bit smaller than what's written on this particular diagram, and we'll talk more about it in a future week when we talk about cognitive load theory, about how big it is. And if you don't rehearse it or, think too much about it, then that's gone from your memory as well. So in the workshop that we just had, I mentioned that you might be able to recall what you had for dinner last night, or maybe you can't, or maybe you can't recall what you had for dinner last Tuesday night, unless you're like me and I have the same thing for dinner every night. But you might be able to remember something that you had for dinner if you went out to dinner for your birthday with your friends or your family or whatever, because you've had more sort of rehearsal and there's more emotions tied to that. And so it helps to move it into long-term memory by encoding. So encoding is where the synapses strengthen. And then when we want to get something from our long-term memory, we're going to retrieve it and bring it back into our working memory. When we've got something in working memory, we might rehearse it. So for today's tutorial, rehearsing can just mean like saying it over and over again in your mind. Like I'm trying to remember my friend's telephone number. I'm going to say it over and over again until I get a piece of paper and I can write it down, and then I can let it go from my working memory. I don't need to encode it because I've written it on a piece of paper. There are other things up the top here, maintenance and elaborative things that we'll talk about in another module where we talk about learning strategies and different kinds of learning strategies. Okay, so we're going to go through sort of one section of that diagram at a time. Every second, your brain is receiving thousands of signals, sounds and colors and movements and the feeling of your clothes and sitting on the chair. All of that is coming into your brain. There's a couple of different ways that we sort of filter information so that our brain is not overwhelmed by it all. And one of them is through attention. So the sensory memory is holding the information for a second or less than a second. And then if it grabs our attention, we'll send it into the working memory. Now, here I've written about the reticular activating system, which is in the brain stem. And that I didn't write this in the notes, but I just wanted to mention it because it's interesting. It's always looking out for novelty and change. So any sort of sudden movement or sudden noise or someone calling out to you in the street saying your name, that's what your reticular activating system is looking out for. And that's an older part of your brain if you're thinking about it evolutionarily speaking. And there's another part of your brain called the salience network, which is in sort of the newer part of your brain, evolutionarily speaking. That's a network that goes throughout your brain and it focuses on things that are salient or important. So stay with this thing, it matters, your brain is saying. An interesting thing about the reticular activating system is, say you've probably experienced this. You say to yourself, okay, I've decided that I really want to buy a red Volkswagen. And you've never noticed red Volkswagens around anywhere. And suddenly, now that you're interested in red Volkswagens, your reticular activating system is looking out for it and pointing them out to you all the time. And suddenly there's thousands of red Volkswagens everywhere. They were always there. You didn't care about them before, so your reticular activating system didn't bring them to your attention. Wow. So that's just a little side story, I guess. Um, so together, your sensory memory and your attention are going to decide what goes into your working memory. And that's why some stimuli capture your attention and some don't. For teachers, this means that attention is biological, not just behavioral. So if in the classroom an activity doesn't trigger these systems through either curiosity or movement or emotional relevance, then students might not be able to maintain focus no matter how motivated they are. So part of our job is to design learning that competes successfully for the brain's attention filter. Getting harder and harder these days with the scrolling and the attention span getting much shorter, but that's still sort of part of what we need to do. Right, so once our attention has selected the information, it enters into the working memory, which is like a short-term workspace for thinking and understanding. So working memory is where learning is actually happening. It's where we compare any of the new information that's coming in with things that we already know. So we're going to be drawing some things in, retrieving things from our long-term memory and comparing them to what we've got in our working memory. Most people can hold about 7 items in there for only a few seconds at a time, unless they actively rehearse them. One of the things that you can do, see how it's got here 7 to 9 chunks? Sometimes you can remember something longer because you remember it in a chunk. So as a chunk, it only takes up 1 slot in your working memory rather than 4 slots, for example. So when you remember telephone number, you might go 0400, and that's only taking up 1 slot instead of 3 slots. So if you chunk something, you can fit more in there. So rehearsal is about repeating the information over and over again, or explaining it to somebody, or maybe drawing a sketch or anything like that. So as long as it's keeping it active in your working memory long enough, then hopefully you can start to build some of these synaptic connections between the neurons. And then when those neural patterns stabilize, we call that encoding, because we've now moved it from working memory into long-term memory. And sleep is a really important part of that. So people who don't get enough sleep often have a little bit of a bad memory because they're not able to get that extra activity that happens while you're asleep to happen. So the word that we used for that in the content was synaptogenesis, and that's when we grow new synapses to make the links between the nerves. For teachers, we need to think about providing opportunities to think with the new material. So not just like read it one time, but try to explain it or use it or relate it to something we already know so that encoding can occur. And later when we talk about cognitive load theory, we're also going to talk about schema theory. And schema are networks that we can sort of pin our new knowledge onto. And when I used to teach both at the previous university where I was, we had, I worked in science, so I taught in laboratories and things. And so I would often ask a question, a student asked me a question and I'll ask a question back again. And I did the same when I was a teacher at school. And you kind of got to get the students used to you doing that because they feel a little bit attacked when you ask them a question back. But what you're doing is you're looking for where they are on their learning journey so that you know where to pin the new piece of information. All right, so there are some rehearsal activities that better support encoding than others. So for example, just saying it over and over and over again, it may or may not get it to encode. If you're reading, things like highlighting the information, that's probably not going to help you encode it very well. Whereas if you extract that information out and use it in a different way by drawing a picture or explaining it, that is going to help you encode it more strongly. All right, so once our information has been encoded, it's going to move into the long-term memory. That's your brain's got a really enormous storage system in there, and people say that its capacity is infinite and its duration is permanent. It kind of depends a little bit. In theory, it is. There are definitely people who can remember every single thing that's ever happened to them or been said to them or that they've ever seen through their whole life. So it does appear that our memory is infinite and can be permanent. But for most normal people, for want of a better word, we forget things after a while. So if we're not actively using it and making the connections more and more stable, then after a while there's pruning and it'll prune it away and get rid of it because you're not using it very much. So your brain tends to hold not individual facts as much as networks of connected ideas. And we'll come back to that when we talk about schema theory. The stronger and more meaningful those links are, the easier retrieval becomes. And I can remember some years back, one of the study strategies that they had, when they sort of first started talking about learning strategies, they would say, make sure you have a dedicated place to study and that it's distraction free and all of that kind of thing. And then they sort of said, well, hang on, no, maybe that's not as good as if you study the same thing in several different environments, then you've got more links to more different things. So if you study in a cafe and also at McDonald's and also at your desk and you study the same information, some scientists, I guess, believe that that helps you make more connections between that information and things in the real world. So, if you listen to music, maybe you listen to different kinds of music while you study the same kind of thing. So none of this is entirely known. Okay, there's still a lot of science and experiments and things like that happening about how the brain actually works. It's kind of one of the things that we don't really know. We don't really know about our own brains. So retrieval is a really important thing. So retrieval is when we reactivate a stored network and pull the information back into working memory so we can use it. And you might have noticed that I use retrieval a fair bit in the content that's on the website. So I'll give you some information, some videos, some readings, whatever, and then I will have some questions for you to retrieve the information. And wherever I can, I've used multiple choice questions so that you know whether you got it right or wrong. All right, so retrieval has been heavily studied as a learning strategy and a study strategy, and it really does help strengthen the pathways. If you're interested in that kind of thing, you can look up papers on retrieval practice, or sometimes it's called the testing effect, where if you test, so you give different students the same information, you test these ones, the next day and then a week later, and they remember it, and you don't test these ones until 6 weeks later and they don't remember it. So if you do the continual testing, you are strengthening the encoding. The trick in school is to make that fun and not like a test. Okay, so you've got to get your kids to have a better relationship with formative testing, like little games, trivia quizzes and things like that, so that you can help them with retrieval practice. So forgetting isn't the absence of learning. It's usually what happens when the connections aren't reactivated often enough. So the unused pathways in the brain begin to fade, and there's some pruning of the unused memories. So for teachers, this means that we need to review information a lot, and we need to make things applicable to things that the kids know about. So application of the knowledge rather than just remembering, which is, again, we'll come back to Bloom's pyramid, which I've talked to you about before with the verbs. Okay, so we want to be working at the apply level of information rather than just at the remember level. All right, so now we've seen how information moves through the system, we can have a look at where the process might break down. So it could break down at the sensory stage when attention was never locked on because of a distraction or an overstimulation, and then the information simply didn't ever get into the working memory in the first place. The second place it can break down is at the working memory stage, and this is if you give the learners too much information all at once and they've only got 7 slots to put information in, and you give them 10 different things, they can't do it. Some of the things are going to fall out of their working memory, or you don't rehearse it long enough, or you don't review it often enough. That's when the working memory stage fails. And the same for long term. This is about maintenance. So you need to revisit information that you've already learned. So one of the learning strategies that they say is really good is interleaving. Have any of you heard of interleaving? That's where if you were studying for exams, for example, you would study some chemistry, and then you might study some English, and then you might come back and do some chemistry again. So you don't just cram chemistry, you interleave it with some other things. And you might notice that I do that a little bit with the content here. Like, I'm telling you about information processing theory today, and we'll visit it again in a couple of weeks' time. And the same with Vygotsky. I told you about Vygotsky last week, and then next week we're going to look at Vygotsky again. So that's what interleaving is. And it's a really good way of doing your recall practice. So what are we gonna do? We're gonna see how this, oh no, hang on, wait. I've got a little video that I want to show you here.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half miss the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it, but did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion.
How many
Learn more
people
about this illusion and the original gorilla.
How many people saw the gorilla?
I did, but I
I'm going to
didn't
type.
notice the curtain.
Yeah, it's an old experiment. I've used it. I think it's from like 15 years ago down the bottom there. So about 2010. 2010 is when I finished my degree in my teaching degree, and I did use that in some classes because I taught science and I wanted the kids to pay attention. But yeah, I saw the gorilla this time because I knew that the gorilla was going to be there, but I didn't notice the curtain and I didn't notice the player leaving. So that's about selective attention. And there's lots of those videos around if you ever do want to use them in class. I'll just get my PowerPoint back again. There we go. All right, so I've got some questions now. We're going to do some questions and do some retrieval practice and see what you remember. All right, so during a noisy group activity, one student never hears the teacher's instructions to pack up. Where is the potential problem in the IPT, which is Information Processing Theory model? I'm not sure if I've mentioned to you guys or not, because I feel like I say this to all of my students every week, but these are anonymous, these things. I don't know who's answered or who hasn't answered. So you shouldn't be afraid that I'm going to judge you if you get it wrong. But also, from a brain perspective, there are experiments that show that if you sit on the fence and wait to see what the answer is, you won't remember it. So you might think, all right, well, the answer's D, but I'm just going to wait. I'm not going to lock it in. I'm not going to commit. You won't remember it. But if you lock it in, it doesn't matter if you get it right or wrong, you'll remember it. Okay, so that's the reason that I have them in there, because I'm doing the retrieval practice with you and I'm helping you to lock it in. All right, so let's have a look. And popular opinion is that the attention filter has failed, and that is correct. All right, so let's have a look at the next one. The student repeats a new concept definition to themselves several times while writing it in their notes. Which part of the system are they using? So we're still talking about this IPT model. So which part of the IPT model are they using? All right, they are using the working memory with rehearsal. That is correct. All right, two students read the same passage. One explains it in their own words, the other rereads it silently. Who is more likely to remember and why? All right, so the answer is the paraphraser, because they've done that slightly deeper processing. When they connect it to other networks more fully, they'll be able to remember it better. And we will go into that a little bit more. So, a teacher introduces vocabulary words by linking them to familiar concepts from last week. Which process is being supported? Mm. Let's have a look. And the answer is retrieval, okay? Because we're linking it to something that's in our long-term memory. So we're retrieving it from long-term memory. All right, now this one, oh no, the next one. A class learned a poem last month but haven't revisited it since. Most can no longer recite it. What happened inside the brain? All right, so that is the correct answer. So the neural connections weakened from disuse. Now this one is interesting. So a student listens carefully during a science demonstration but remembers almost nothing later. Which process most likely failed? All right, so the most correct answer is encoding. So they paid attention, they listened carefully, but they remember almost nothing later. And there's some interesting experiments around this, and this is called the illusion of comprehension. If you go to a lecture and the lecturer is very organized, or the science teacher is very organized, and they give you a really good lecture, demonstration, whatever, and you're sitting there and you're going, yes, this makes perfect sense. I understand exactly what's going on. You're in a certain context where it does make sense. And then later on, when you're outside of that context, it doesn't make sense because you haven't actually encoded it. So they did some studies where they had some lecturers give really good lectures versus some other lecturers who gave not as good lectures, but a bit more sort of disorganized. And they found that neither lecturer was better, like the students within the classes got about the same marks. And that's because of the students doing the work on their own. So they have to think about it in their own brain. And another place where you might come across this is when you are reading the textbook, for example, and you're highlighting and you're making, maybe some notes in the columns in the margins. It all makes perfect sense. It's so logical. It's set out so nicely. But then as soon as you step away from that context and you go to the exam where they ask you a question that doesn't follow the exact logic of the textbook, you don't remember, okay? Because you've had an illusion of comprehension. You thought you understood it and you didn't really do the cognitive work to understand it properly, basically. All right, so key points. The attention is going to direct what enters into this system, so the information processing theory system. Rehearsal is going to stabilize new neural connections, and deep processing is going to help build meaning. So we'll come back to this deep processing in another module when we talk about the different learning strategies. We'll still talk about rehearsal and retrieval though when we get to there. Retrieval is reactivating and strengthening the networks, and forgetting happens when the pathways aren't used. So like I said in the workshop, neurons that fire together wire together. So if they fire at one straight after the other, that connection gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And neurons that fire out of sync lose their link. So if one fires and the next one doesn't fire, that link will eventually get broken, pruned. Now, one of your items in the assessment task is to compare this IPT to the earlier theories. So the three theories that we looked at last week were Piaget, Vygotsky, and Bronfenbrenner. The item doesn't have Bronfenbrenner in there, but I put him in for completion. So Piaget mapped how thinking changes occur over time as the children's brain matures. And information processing theory helps explain what's actually happening. So why does that happen? Because as the connections are getting made, attention and working memory and the reasoning capacity becomes faster and more efficient as the connections strengthen. So I mentioned in the workshop that when you're a baby, your brain's a certain size and it has a certain number of connections in it. And then as you grow, your brain gets bigger and there's more and more and more and more connections. And that's why things are changing. So that's why last week I kept saying about the architecture of your brain. And in the workshop, I mentioned that when you get to be a teenager, there's some heavy pruning that happens. And that's in the content on Blackboard. So Vygotsky emphasized learning through social interactions and language. So IPT complements this by showing how the brain processes those interactions. So it's holding the dialogue in working memory, it's comparing it to existing ideas, and then it's encoding new meanings through repetition and use. And just for completion, we've got Bronfenbrenner reminding us that learning happens within the layers of context, so family, social, community, and IPT adds a cognitive layer. So those environments provide all the sensory and emotional input that the brain is filtering and processing and storing. So information processing theory doesn't replace any of those frameworks. It's just looking at what's actually happening inside your learner's brain. So basically, IPT is the cognitive blueprint that we are going to be using as we move forward and talk about how different learning processes work. So next week, we've got one more week on development. I think it's mainly about emotional stuff. And then the final 3 weeks of the semester, trimesters, terms, is about the different learning theories and how you might implement them or why you might implement them in the classroom. So one of the ones we're going to look at is cognitive load theory, and that's where we look at working memory and how much things can fit in there and how we might design our learning experiences so that we're not overloading working memory. And we're going to also talk about schema theory, which is about understanding these long-term networks and how we can use them to help us with the cognitive load. And then we're going to move on to metacognition and self-regulated learning. So we're going to talk about managing attention and people's ability to think about their thinking and manage their own thinking. So this theory is the blueprint to that. And then as per my standard, these are the learning objectives. These are the learning objectives that you need to look at the end of the week and decide whether or not you can do all of those things. So can you in fact explain that and describe that and apply this theory? All right, just to wrap it up, learning depends on attention, rehearsal, and retrieval, not just on effort. So we might be putting a lot of effort into highlighting in our textbook, but if we put 10 hours of effort in highlighting, we might have been better off spending an hour on retrieval practice rather than highlighting. So some learning strategies are better than others. The brain strengthens connections each time information is used or revisited. So that's why current studies are saying that retrieval practice is one of the most effective strategies. And effective teaching designs experiences that work with and not against these processes. Actually, I'm just going to skip that one and go out of there and stop sharing so that I can see you all again and see what questions you might have. I know I'm a little short again today. I kind of hope that you guys will talk to me some more soon as you get more comfortable with the subject.
Hi Vicky, it's Michaela here. Hello.
Hi.
I was just on your last point about how retrieval strategies are more effective. I guess I was just trying to think back to my schooling and lessons, and I guess I didn't do a lot of that. I was doing more the reading and highlighting and listening and thinking, yeah, this all makes sense. And I was just thinking back to maybe what my teachers did or didn't do, and maybe just your experience of. I guess I'm trying to say is what are some maybe examples of, I mean, you showed us some examples of retrieval strategies, but I guess like in practice, like, is that like spending maybe 5 minutes at the end of the lesson, like getting students to summarize or write down main points, or what are some maybe like
Yeah.
5 minute things
Yeah.
that, as an example? Yeah.
Yeah. That's that sort of thing, like an exit ticket or, you know, a minute paper where you just say, write down everything you learnt today, or what was the hardest thing that we did today, or, you know, I've used those kinds of questions.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so that kind of thing. And you know, Kahoot and things like that, where they can
Mm,
compete a little bit.
mm,
But they tend to like that kind of thing. I think it's, you know, building a different relationship with
mm,
testing. I know there's some, you know, all the testing that we do is bad. And obviously the kids get a certain relationship with doing tests.
mm,
But if we can sort of turn their thinking around so that it's not a test, it's, you know, it's a self-evaluation. It's like just seeing how I'm going. It's just checking in with myself.
mm. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
No
On the
worries.
same topic, at my recent prac, what the mentor used to do was that after the lesson was over, she would she would have these five MCQs at two as the end of every lesson, MCQ questions, and then they would do that together as a class. And then she had a sticker sheet, and she used to have fun that way. She would give out stickers to the students, and these were year 7 and 8 students, and
Yeah.
they would be really engaged. And I saw them that they wanted to participate. They would be raising their hands even when they answered a question wrong. It was basically an opportunity to reiterate a concept. So I really
Yeah.
like that method of, just five MCQs, and she would summarize all the things that she had said in the lesson. So it was a good, I think, way to check their understanding as well as correct any concept that they got wrong, maybe.
Yeah, for sure. And it's partly about making it so that mistakes are not seen as something bad. Um, you know, so that kids are not scared of making a mistake.
Yes, 100%. And I think that that's where building relationships come in the class. So the students, they knew that they had that relationship with the teacher, and they knew her expectations from the class, and they knew that it was a mutual respect kind of a thing. So even if somebody was saying the wrong answer, nobody was, making fun of them or anything. And so I think that comes with building positive relationships in the class. So I think
Yeah, for sure.
these things,
That sounds really awesome.
Yeah,
yeah,
it
learn.
sounds
I
awesome. It's a
found
good
that
idea.
learning, yeah, and I found that learning and this went hand in hand. The quality of learning and the effective teacher-student relationship, it really was going hand in hand.
Another way that I've done these MCQs, you know, just to check their understanding, is they go in a group and they all have to fill it, they get the questions and they write what they think is the answer, and then you collect that up, and then they have to discuss as a group and hand in a group one. So not everyone in the group might think that A is the right answer, and they have to convince each other and they have to agree on an answer before they can submit. I used to use that. I mean, things are different now because of technology, but I used to use that with these little scratch cards, like a
Like a gift
lottery
card.
ticket scratchy,
Lottery
like a
tickets, yeah.
scratchy. Yeah, and they, have A, B, C, D, E for each answer, and then you give them the questions, and underneath the correct answer is a little star. So if they get it wrong, they know straight away they've got it wrong, and they can try a different one until they see the little star. So they were really good. I love those. But yeah, it's
Yeah,
different
that's a good
times.
idea as well.
I don't have any more
Yeah, I have a question.
information. Yeah.
Sorry, excuse me. I just want to double check for the references in the assignment one. Do we need to use all the articles provided in class, or can we use like external sources?
Yes, you can use any external sources you like, as long as they are, primary or secondary sources. So preferably peer reviewed,
Okay.
but textbooks count. Okay, so textbooks count as a peer reviewed thing.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No worries.
Vicky, I think Amy's just popped a question in the chat.
Okay, how do we investigate or find out? Well, it depends on the disability that they have. I'm not sure. I've done so many tutorials this week. I can't remember where I said this, but for something like autism or ADHD, there can be like a sensory overload. So their working memory is full of these sensory information, and it's much more difficult for them to pay attention. So that's a thing with those kinds of learners. But yeah, it really depends on the disability that they have. There are a lot of professional development. Like I did some professional development when I was a teacher on autism. So there is a lot of professional developments that come through different schools and help you understand different disabilities or disorders or whatever you want to
And
call
I
them.
think mostly schools that have these resources, they have the inclusion support available. And there
Yeah,
are
they do.
inclusion support centers and there are inclusion support staff that are working with these students with disabilities, and they are making sure
Yes.
that they're catching up on their assessments and basically they're learning in the class. So I think, yeah.
That was certainly my experience working in schools around this area in the Clarence Valley. If students had individual education plans, they might have a support person who comes to the classes with them, or the support person might work with you to develop particular resources for that particular learner.
Yeah, because the school that I did prac in, they also had that available for the students, and they were doing it really well.
Yeah. I think you guys do some subjects that are more about sort of diversity and inclusion and stuff than this
Yes,
one.
we did do teaching students from diverse backgrounds. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if everybody has done that, but it's a core. So
Yeah.
those who haven't done it, they're going to do it at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there's a new cohort that just started this term. So I think that there's a lot of people in this subject who this is their first subject.
Yep.
All right. Well, if you haven't got any other questions right now, a teacher's aide, yeah. One of my friends just studied to be a teacher's aide as well. And yes, not all schools do have them anymore. And it is a shame because when you're a teacher, you've got so many boxes to tick. It's really helpful to have those teacher's aides if you have special needs students,
It's
because
also
it's
about
just
the
so many boxes to tick.
yeah. It's also about the resources. I mean, some
Yes.
smaller schools in some very regional towns don't have those resources that maybe tier one schools might have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did a lot of after hours work when I was teaching. It's just there is just so many different aspects that you have to think of, and so many kids, because I taught high school, so there was 30 kids per year times 6 years, because you tend to get one classroom each year. And even if you don't, like at one school, I convinced them that I should be allowed to have 2 year 7 science so that I could plan it a bit more in depth. So for that particular year, I had 2 year 7s. So that was half the planning for year 7. But then I had 8, 9, 10 and 12. I don't think I had a year 11 that year.
Vicky, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Assignment due days is 14th of November. Once
Mm-hmm.
we finish our assignment, so if we need to submit our assessment early, so when you gonna open this link
You
for
should
the
be able to see
submission?
it now. I think it opened on Monday. So
Okay.
if I go back in there,
Yes.
and the other thing that I mentioned in the workshop is I'll put a draft thing up tomorrow. I've still got another tutorial tonight. So tomorrow I will put up the draft one. But if you go to the assessment task, it should be visible now, because when I watched the video of how to do this, it said to set it so that it opened 2 weeks before the due date rather than 3 weeks before. So it should have opened on Monday. So when you go to the bottom now, you should be able to see this. So if I go
Oh,
to edit mode is off, so this is the view that you should have. So you should be able to go in there. So when you go in there, you'll see that screen that says submit, upload, or something like that.
all right. Thank you.
And you can do it up until the due date. Yes, Amy?
I just felt like it was easier just talking rather than typing. But is there any examples that we can look at or that we can have like just a quick view of, you can share or see? Just because I'm a very visual learner, and obviously
Yep.
I've read the theories and all of that, and I've went through the work. But for me, I find it easier looking at examples. I find it really helpful.
Yep. So if you go into this portfolio folder, just here, there's a folder says example of previous students' work. So if you go in there,
Oh,
there is a one from a past student. So
thank you so much. I didn't even
yeah,
realize that was there.
yeah, no, that's all right. There's quite a lot of resources, and it's easy to miss things. Okay, so that's all good. I don't think there's one like that for the next task. Let's have a look. I think we load you up on the first task and then hope that you've got it from there. Oh no, there is previous students' work. So there's a case study example there as well. So that's awesome. But yeah, if you have any other questions, just pop them in the discussion board. That's the easiest place. I mean, you can feel free to email me as well, but it's better if you put them in the discussion board, because other students will probably have similar questions to you. So if I answer them over there, everybody can see it. All right, I'm going to go. And you all have a good week, and I'll see you next week.
Yes, see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Vicky.
I really appreciate.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.